and this video is the third in a series all about my tumor. I had a Pheochromocytoma that was diagnosed in 2011, and make sure you watch my other two videos where I talk about my symptoms and the process of getting diagnosed, and this video is all about the process of getting treatment and recovery. So I was already in Gilroy when I found out that I definitely had this tumor, and that I was definitely going to have the surgery at Stanford, and that they were very excited to have me. And apparently a lot of doctors never have a patient with this type of tumor. They never see a patient with this type of tumor. It's a new area of science where they're learning about how to treat this type of tumor and the best way to safely get it out of their patients and keep them alive. So I don't think I actually went home to Vacaville at this point. I think because I was in Gilroy, I just waited a few days, and then I had my first consultation at Stanford with my surgical team. This type of tumor reacts with anesthesia, and that's what makes the procedure so dangerous. So the anesthesiologist is really one who's monitoring the patient and who is dispensing the medication and then decides when it's safe to operate and really sets everything in motion. So I met with the surgeon and we discussed briefly everything that was going to happen and what type of surgery it was going to be. It was going to be laparoscopic, and then if anything went south in the middle of the surgery, they'd have to do a larger incision and rush to get the tumor out and then close me up and stabilize me. So I knew that that was a possibility, and I told him, if you have to do that, just promise me that you'll sew up my incision in the shape of a lightning bolt. And he's like, I think I can do that. And I think my dad went with me to this appointment. So I met with the surgeon, and honestly, he's this amazing surgical oncologist at Stanford, and he, of course, teaches the med students there, and he has a ton of experience. He's done this same procedure before several times, which is amazing. Apparently, there are only a couple surgical teams in the United States that have experience with this type of tumor. And my anesthesiologist is one of something like 6 specialists who have their clinical focus on pheochromocytoma. So I had one of the only 6 people in the country, if not the world, who were able to keep me safe and pull off this surgery without a hitch. So after I met with the surgeon, there was a little bit of wait time. They had me go into another room by myself without my dad, and they had me meet with someone who I guess is kind of like a grief counselor, and they just went over if I had an advance directive and what I want on that. Advance directive is basically your preference for medical decisions and end-of-life decisions if things go really bad. So I had to do all of that stuff. They had to counsel me because of the nature of the surgery, and yeah, that was kind of dark and morbid and troubling. And then I was able to go into another room, and I brought my dad with me, and we met with the anesthesiologist. And he went over what he was going to do for the surgery and what the treatment plan was leading up to the surgery. So he told me I definitely still needed to be on bed rest, and he prescribed phenoxybenzamine. So phenoxybenzamine, let's see if I can remember this, is a non-selective alpha receptor antagonist. I think the brand name is dibenzoline. I think there's only one manufacturer of this drug in the United States. Basically, it's an alpha blocker. And he prescribed me this medication, and he actually he had a pocket with a tissue full of these capsules, and he's like, here, take these will get you started. I collect them for my other patients who haven't used them because they're pretty expensive, unfortunately. But this was the one medication I could take to make it safe to operate. I think I started out taking something like 3 pills twice a day or something like that. And this is GoodRx price analysis of the 10 milligram phenoxybenzamine 60 capsules. Kroger 7,128, Walmart 7,129. Pricey medication right there. Ridiculous. And I think what it came out to with my health insurance, which is amazing coverage, is that the pills were $12 each. So I started out taking something like 3 of them 2 times a day, and this is a whole other stressor on top of everything else. I'm already out of money, I'm barely making any money, I've got a couple paychecks coming from films I just did. The day before surgery, I think I had to take something like 6 of them 4 times a day or something like that. So it was very expensive. It was very expensive. It was insanely expensive and so stressful. I don't even want to think about it. And on top of that, before I could even get access to that medication, I went to every single pharmacy in the town where I lived, and none of them had it because it's not used very often and only one company manufactures it. So I had to call my physician. He had to put me on a beta blocker instead in the meantime. I had to get that. That wasn't covered by my insurance, so I had to pay full price for that. Then I was finally able to get the phenoxybenzamine, and it was insanely expensive. With my insurance, it came out to about $12 a pill. Basically, I would take my medication as directed by my anesthesiologist. We'd email every single night. I would take my blood pressure several times a day and email him what my blood pressure was, what time I took it. He advised me on all of these things I was not allowed to eat because they would raise my blood pressure. He put me on a high sodium diet to make it safer to operate. He told me I couldn't have Sudafed because that would also mimic the hormones from the tumor and it would make my blood pressure go up. So there were all these rules and regulations, and I was just trying to distract myself. Unfortunately, a side effect of the phenoxybenzamine was that I became extremely paranoid. So I didn't drive. I could not drive. I was too terrified. My husband would be driving and I would just be looking at all of these road signs. If we crashed into that would decapitate me. Having these bizarre thoughts of all of these terrible things that could happen. I was absolutely terrified. If I felt weird at all, it would just raise my blood pressure and be awful. Every time I had to poop, it would give me anxiety. The sensation of having to poop would make me feel like I was gonna die. And then I'd go poop and I'd be like, oh, I just had to poop. And Mike would be like, yeah, I told you. It was nothing. But I was convinced that I was dying, and I was like, maybe we should go to the hospital. I really don't feel good. It's just poop. So yeah, this was a really rough medication to be on. And I think I was on bed rest before surgery for a total of a month. I was taking a massive amount of this medication. And finally, my blood pressure readings were really steady. I had a normal blood pressure level. Unfortunately, if I stood up too quickly, I would pass out. And that's a side effect of the medication. My husband, who was my then boyfriend, would go to work and I would be home alone, and I wouldn't even answer the door. I was so terrified of everything. I was so paranoid. I couldn't function. And so I was just trying to distract myself with YouTube videos. So I would watch romantic comedies all day long. I would only sleep during the day with the blinds open so that it was sunny and looked pretty and happy. I would just lie in bed watching these romantic comedies and maybe doze off for 20 minutes at a time, but I would not let myself sleep. I would have to just fall asleep against my will because I was so scared that if I went to sleep, I would die. At night, I would not let Mike turn off the lights to go to sleep. I would lay in bed and I could fall asleep for maybe half an hour if I was laying on top of him and fell asleep. And then I would wake up terrified, and I would take my blood pressure to make sure it hadn't gotten too high. And then I would get out of bed and I'd go sit on the sofa and I would watch YouTube videos. YouTube videos on crafts and things that I was able to distract myself with, and things that were light and fluffy. Other than the physical process being very difficult, it was super lonely. This was right at the beginning of when everyone started being on social media, so everyone knew what was going on with me, and publicly and via social media only, they were very supportive. And I appreciate that, and I realize that this is the only way that some people know how to be supportive. Hardly anyone would call me. I had 2 friends who I would call them and they would talk with me, and I think people just have this subconscious aversion to sick people. They know logically that you're not contagious, that being around you is not going to make them sick, but something on a primal level keeps them from wanting to be there. So for this whole month of bed rest prior to my surgery, and then even when I went to Gilroy for a couple of days before my surgery, no one visited me. Not a single person visited me before my surgery. That really sucked. It was a really long month, and it was very, very lonely. And I wouldn't wish that on anyone, especially like when your mind is racing and your hormones are so out of whack that like it's impossible to stay out of this really dark place. So Mike and I went to Gilroy, where I grew up, and we were staying with my parents before the surgery. And so as we got closer to the surgery, I think I was talking with the anesthesiologist, and we had like a 6-day window in which he thought we were going to do the surgery. And because I was so far from Stanford, we knew that I was going to go to Gilroy for the days prior to the surgery, and then for my recovery directly after the surgery, just so I could be close to the hospital and it would keep everything safer and it would be less distance to travel on the day of the surgery. And this whole time there was like this shift in my thinking where I felt deep down that I was going to die. It's hard to explain, but it's almost like I could see death in my peripheral vision. Like an entity, like a tangible, physical entity of death, and death was coming for me. And if I had been able to sleep, at least I would have been able to sleep through all of these horrible feelings, but I was just there awake trying to distract myself with romantic comedies and failing miserably. So that last few days was very, very difficult, and I got to the point where I couldn't continue pretending to feel okay and to just feel hopeful. And you know, like I told my dad, like I really feel like I'm gonna die, and I'm terrified. I'm really, really scared, and it's probably just the hormones and it's probably just the medication, but I don't like feeling this way. And so, you know, we prayed a lot and just tried to do things that would relax me. He tried to make me all of my favorite foods just to have like these warm, fuzzy feelings. And then I think somewhere in this point, it's actually pretty hard to remember because I was in like such a medication fog. I had another appointment at Stanford, and they gave me like a special soap for me to scrub the surgical site the night before. And then on June 27th, I got an email from my anesthesiologist saying, I would like for you to be here for surgery at 5 a.m. tomorrow. And I think it caught me off guard a little because I thought, you know, we were at the beginning of this 6-day window in which they thought I might have the surgery. So I had a dinner of Puerto Rican food at like 4 p.m. because I couldn't have any food for 12 hours prior to surgery. And I knew from a previous surgery the anesthesia made me super nauseous. So I was asking about things that I could do to help combat that. And one of the ways was to make sure I was as hydrated as possible. So I drank 2.5 gallons of Gatorade the day before my surgery, like a psychopath. I wanted to make really sure that I was not dehydrated because I did not want to be nauseous. And then that night, my mom got sick because I think my mom was like too stressed to handle the situation. And when she gets stressed, her body just shuts her down. So she got a really bad cold that night, and I like couldn't have any contact with her because I couldn't risk getting sick before surgery, and that was really rough. And my sister, one of my sisters was still in town. My other sister was already living somewhere else at this point. So the next morning I got up at 4 a.m. and my dad and my sister and my boyfriend and I went to the hospital. And I had, you know, my meetings with my anesthesiologist assistant, and he kind of went over all the medications they were going to give me and everything that they were going to do for the procedure and how long the procedure was going to be. They had just done this procedure on someone else a month before, so everyone was primed and ready to go. And from a schooling standpoint, they were very excited to have me. It was really difficult for all of these nerdy physicians and scientists to hide just how excited they were by my tumor. Great, thanks. So I was able to have my dad and my sister and my boyfriend in the pre-op room with me, and the anesthesiologist assistant came in and he started my IV, prepped the area, they cleaned it, they marked it. I said goodbye to my dad and my sister and my boyfriend, and at that point, I was still feeling like I was gonna die, and I was just trying to pretend that I was excited and hopeful, but really I was so freaking terrified. And then they administered this sedative via the IV, and I started to feel a lot better. So, you know, they weren't putting me to sleep yet. I had to say goodbye to everyone, and they started to wheel me back. And I was like making conversation with people and just trying to be happy and peppy, and, you know, was finally starting to relax. And they wheeled me into the hallway, like through the doors into the operating area. And there was like this big board with light up numbers, and number 11 was lit up. And 11 for me is like the symbol that I'm on the right path and that I'm making good choices and like that things are going well. So I was like really happy to see number 11 lit up. I'm like, oh, am I going to be in operating room 11? They're like, no, you're going to be in operating room 9. And I was like, oh, okay, well, whatever. I still saw 11 lit up. So then they wheel me into the operating room, and they wheeled me up next to the operating table, and it was like a cold metal, like, you know those metal toilet seats in like public rest stops? It was like that kind of like steel, and it felt like it was refrigerated. And I remember lifting myself onto the operating table and like scooting over, and then they started giving me a little bit of the anesthesia, I guess. And at this point I was told to count backwards from 10, and I don't remember actually making it past 5, but at this point, usually the next step in your consciousness would be waking up post-op. When they started the anesthesia, there was a song playing on the radio, and then the next thing I remember was the end of that song. And I was on the operating table, and I was completely awake, but I couldn't move. And unfortunately, the anesthesia didn't work the way it was supposed to, but I have a whole other video about what happened and how I had anesthesia awareness, which is basically where you're awake during surgery. So I was conscious but paralyzed for the 4.5-hour procedure, and left me with some pretty severe PTSD and was a gnarly experience. So go watch that video if you want to know all about that. And the last thing I remember was the end of the surgery when they were talking about anesthesia, and, you know, they were wrapping everything up, and he said, like, basically that he wanted me to be asleep for a good amount of time after the surgery. So the last thing I remember was them putting more stuff in my IV, and I remember, like, how it burned in my veins, and it's weird. Like, it felt cold, but it burned at the same time. And the next thing I remember was waking up in the ICU and opening my eyes, and I couldn't really see anything. Everything was a little bit blurry, but I remember thinking, thank God I'm alive. And just being so happy to be alive, because I honestly didn't think I was going to survive that, and I didn't think I was going to survive the pain of surgery. And my dad and my sister and my boyfriend were all in the room, and there were a couple doctors there. And the first thing I said when I woke up was, can I see it? And I was asking about the tumor. So they're like, oh, well, I mean, we don't have it here. And I kept asking, like, throughout the day if I could see this tumor. And at one point, I think he was the chief resident. He was in the room, and I said, can I see the tumor? And he's like, oh, well, it's in the lab, you know, they have to analyze it, but I have a picture of it on my iPhone. So he showed me the picture of my tumor. I'll show you, but just be warned, it's pretty gnarly, it's pretty graphic, so if you don't want to see my disgusting tumor and my adrenal gland, skip forward about 30 seconds so you don't have to see it, because it's pretty gross. So here it is. This is my tumor. You can see it's much bigger than the adrenal gland. That squishy yellow looking stuff is actually my adrenal gland, and that's not at all how it's supposed to look. This was a very sick adrenal gland. You can see just how vascular this tumor was. It has so many, like, really big veins in it, so they know it was definitely in there for a really long time, and, you know, I put a lot of work into growing that thing. So that's my nasty tumor. You're welcome. And I was very excited to see that. I asked if he would email it to me. As soon as I was able to operate my phone, I posted it. So that is all about the actual surgical procedure, and I'm going to end this video here because it's already super long, and in the next video I will be talking about my whole recovery process and what that was like. Be sure to watch the other 2 videos in the beginning of this series to see what everything was like with my symptoms and getting diagnosed, and then watch the next video in this series. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, hit the subscribe button below and post a comment below telling me what you think.